In the 1950s, Ray Kroc sold milkshake machines that allowed one worker to make 5 milkshakes at once. These machines reduced the cost of making milkshakes by allowing restaurants to hire fewer workers. Among Kroc's customers were Dick and Mac McDonald, who used 8 of his machines at their hamburger stand. Kroc became so impressed with Dick and Mac's business that he bought it for himself and started a worldwide restaurant chain. If you visit one of the McDonald's restaurants that are his legacy, you'll see many more examples of cost-saving devices. One is a computer that makes French fries so easy to cook that almost anyone can do it while taking an order from the drive-thru window at the same time. In this module, we'll explore how changes such as these innovations in the production process affect the supply curve. The key idea that you want to focus on in this module is that the supply curve can shift because of a number of changes, what we call supply curve shifters. These are the cost of inputs, government policies, the number of firms, technology, weather, and expectations about future prices. And these affect the supply curve in much the same way that demand curve shifters affected the demand curve. So, the first thing that I will do is to differentiate for you between a movement along the supply curve and a shift of the supply curve. These are two different things, just like there was a difference between a movement along the demand curve and a shift of the demand curve. Then I will explain how changes in factors other than price cause the supply curve to shift. When the price changes, that's movement along the supply curve up or down caused by a change in price, and we say that's a change in quantity supplied. But when these factors change, then they cause the entire supply curve to shift to the right or to the left. And then we will recognize which types of changes cause the supply curve to shift to the left or to the right. We've seen that an increase in the price of pizza from, say, $10 to $15 causes the quantity supplied to increase. That is a movement along the pizza supply curve. That would be as if we had a movement from A to B on that supply curve 1. In that case, only the price and the quantity offered for sale change. When we look at how price changes affect the quantity supplied, we make the ceteris paribus assumption that everything else that could influence the quantity supplied remains the same. But sometimes pizza shops become willing to supply more pizzas for $10 than before, and more for $15 than before. If the quantity firms are willing to supply changes at every price, there is a shift of the supply curve. This is represented by the shift from supply 1 to supply 2. A shift of the supply curve is always the result of something other than a change in the price of the good, such as a change in production costs. Depending on the situation, the supply curve can shift to the left or to the right. After shifting, the supply curve will continue to slope upward because a higher price will still cause firms to supply more of their good to the market. However, when the supply curve shifts, we call the corresponding change in the amount firms are willing to supply at every price a change in supply. If it is necessary to pick up your pencil and draw another supply curve to the right or to the left of the initial one to illustrate a particular change, there has been a change in supply. Let me go back to the previous slide. There has been a change in supply. By contrast, when the price changes, you can illustrate the change by sliding the point of your pencil along the original supply curve, up the curve in the case of a price increase, and down the curve in the case of a price decrease. Now, that movement along the supply curve, like this, going up or down the supply curve, represents what we call a change in quantity supplied. But it is not a change in supply. So, in this section, we now consider the factors that can cause a change in supply, meaning a shift of the entire supply curve. These factors include the cost of inputs, government policy, the number of firms supplying the good, technological change, natural disasters and bad weather, and expectations about a good's future price. The first factor that shifts the supply curve is the cost of inputs. To produce goods, firms must pay for inputs, such as raw materials and workers, land, labor, capital, the factors of production. They have to buy these from households in order to produce the goods and services that we want. We call these factors of production inputs, because they are used to make goods and services. If the costs of these inputs change, there will be a change in supply. The cost of inputs can change for many reasons, including new discoveries of raw materials, changes in the rental costs of buildings and equipment, tax changes, wars, and modified production techniques. Higher input costs shift supply curves to the left, because when it becomes more expensive to produce a good, firms will supply fewer units at any given price. When inputs become less expensive, supply curves shift to the right, because firms will supply more units at any given price. For example, if workers at gasoline refineries are successful in negotiating higher wages, the supply curve for gasoline will shift to the left. This decrease in supply is shown in panel A. The original supply curve is labeled Supply 1, and the new supply curve is labeled Supply 2. Now, what that means is that at every single price, firms are willing to supply a lower quantity because it now costs them more to hire each worker. We can see an example of this by comparing point A on the original supply curve to point B on the new supply curve. At point A on supply 1, 300 million gallons of gasoline are supplied at a price of $3.50 per gallon. But, and that price would be right there, $3.50, and between $3 and $4. But at point B on supply 2, notice only 200 million gallons of gasoline are supplied at the same price. The price is still $3.50, but we have decreased the supply of gasoline. Now, suppose that instead of wages rising, they fall as a result of a large number of unemployed workers desperate for jobs. This lowers input costs and causes the supply curve for gasoline to shift to the right. This increase in supply is shown in panel B. Again, the original supply curve is labeled Supply 1, and the new supply curve is labeled Supply 2. But at every price, notice more is supplied because the cost of producing gasoline has gone down. For example, at point A on supply curve 1, firms supply 300 million gallons of gasoline. But, and that's at a price of $3.50 per gallon. Again, the same price that we were looking at before. But after the shift to supply curve 2, point B shows us that they will now supply more gasoline. They will now supply 400 million gallons of gasoline at the exact same price. So the price has not caused a change in supply. The cost of inputs has caused a change in supply. And in panel A, we had a decrease in supply. In panel B, we had an increase in supply. The second factor that can cause the supply curve to shift would be a change in government policies. Government policies can change the cost of producing a good, or they can change the amount of money that suppliers receive for selling their goods. In either case, the government's actions can cause supply curves to shift. What are these government policies? Well, they include taxes. If the government charges more in taxes, it costs more to make something. If it charges less, it costs less. The government could adopt new rules and regulations for businesses. New rules and regulations cost more to implement, and so it makes it more expensive to make something. And the government can issue what are called subsidies. Subsidies are when the government gives money to a firm to make something, and thus it would cost less to make it. The third factor that can shift the supply curve falls into these categories. So, taxes. Now, I just briefly explained how taxes work. Government raises tax revenue to pay for national defense, schools, roads, and other vital goods and services. Taxes can cause a shift of the supply curve. Suppose that the government collects a tax of 40 cents per pack from suppliers of gum. If a pack of gum is sold for $1, the government gets 40 cents and gum suppliers keep only 60 cents. Because of the tax, the company receives less revenue from selling gum at any given price. The added expense of the tax causes the supply curve for bubble gum to shift to the left, much like the supply curve for gasoline shifted to the left in panel A. The second type of government policy that can affect supply would be government regulations. Regulations are rules that businesses have to follow. Regulations place restrictions on firms and individuals. For example, regulations that require that children's sleepwear be made of flame-resistant material. This prevents firms from using lower-cost material that might endanger children who come too close to a candle, match, lighter, or fireplace. These regulations, while helping avoid injuries and death, also raise the cost of producing children's sleepwear, and therefore they again would shift the supply curve to the left by making it more expensive to supply a good or service. The next type of government policy that can affect the cost of producing a good is a government subsidy. A subsidy is a payment made by the government to support a particular activity or good. For example, the federal government subsidizes the production of corn in a variety of ways, including paying some farmers a subsidy in addition to the price they receive for their corn. These subsidies increase the amount of money that farmers receive per bushel of corn that they grow. Because subsidies raise the profit that farmers earn from supplying corn at a given price, the corn subsidy increases the supply of corn and shifts the supply curve to the right, increasing the supply of corn. Another factor that can affect the supply curve is if the number of firms that produce a good increases. Then supply will increase as well. This figure shows the supply curves for a number of different gasoline stations. It shows the supply curve for general gasoline, the supply curve for national gasoline, and it adds a third gasoline company called domestic gasoline. So we have 3 gasoline companies. Now, with only 2 suppliers, the market curve would have been supply curve would have been supply without domestic. That would be this supply curve right here. That's the supply curve with only 2 firms in the market. The new market supply curve, however, is found by adding the quantity supplied at each price by the third firm, domestic gasoline, to the other 2 firms. The result is a rightward shift of the supply curve to this new one here called supply with domestic. So what does that do? If the number of firms producing increases, the supply curve is going to shift to the right. And you can see that's exactly what it did right here. It's small, but you can see that the supply curve shifted from the first one right here to the second one right here. And that was shifting it to the right. Likewise, if the number of firms producing a good decreases, the supply curve will shift to the left in the opposite direction. The next factor that can affect the supply curve, as we review these, would be technological change. Technology refers to the methods used to create goods and services from inputs. The discovery of a new production method that enables firms to produce more goods from the same inputs, or from new, less costly inputs, is called technological progress. When technological progress occurs, firms' costs decrease and production becomes more profitable. At any price for the good, firms will want to produce more than before. This causes the supply curve to shift again to the right. as in panel B. Now, suppose that a process is invented that enables gasoline refineries to make twice as much gasoline from every barrel of crude oil as before, while using the same amount of all of their inputs. Then producing and selling any quantity of gasoline will become less costly and more profitable than before. As a result, at any given price, gasoline firms will want to produce and sell more, and the supply curve for gasoline will shift rightward, as we've seen. The next factor that can affect the supply curve would be natural disasters and weather. Natural disasters and unusually bad weather have the opposite effect of technological progress. These events require some types of firms to use more inputs to produce any given quantity of their goods, and thus cause the supply curve to shift to the left, as in panel A. For example, during a drought, orange growers will have to pay for greater amounts of water to irrigate their groves. Because the cost of producing each orange has increased, growers will want to produce fewer oranges at any given price. So the supply curve for oranges shifts to the left as a result of the drought. Similarly, natural disasters make it more costly to produce some types of goods, thereby shifting their supply curves leftward. The earthquake and tsunami that struck Japan in 2011 disrupted rail and highway transportation and cut off the supply of electricity to many homes and businesses. Some Japanese firms used more expensive power generators to replace electricity from power utilities. The transportation of inputs and goods became more costly as firms followed longer travel routes to bypass the affected areas. The disasters even caused the Toyota Motor Corporation to temporarily close several factories. This reduced the quantity of cars supplied to the United States by more than 40,000 units. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina caused similar spikes in transportation and energy costs in the United States, crippling many businesses. And massive floods in Australia in 2011 shifted the supply curve for the global steel market leftward, as floods disrupted the supply of Australian coal and raised the cost of this important input for steel production. Finally, the final factor that can affect the supply curve would be expectations about future prices. Unlike perishable goods such as tomatoes and milk, goods such as light bulbs and dishwashers can be stored over time. For storable goods, the seller has a choice between selling the good now or in the future. Light bulb manufacturers will be reluctant to sell now if they think bulb prices will rise in the near future. Instead, they will find it more profitable to store some of the light bulbs they have made in what we call inventory. Inventory is temporary storage, and they would keep it there until the price increases. But remember, the supply for a good tells us how much is offered for sale now, not in the future. So expectations that the price will rise in the future cause today's supply curve to shift to the left. Now the opposite is true if sellers expect prices to fall in the near future. They will begin to sell now. So when the light bulb price is expected to fall, the supply curve for light bulbs will shift to the right, causing an increase in supply. The effect of future prices on supply occurs mainly for goods that can be stored in inventory for some time. For goods that can spoil easily, they cannot be stored. For example, yogurt, bananas, and cakes. Expectations about future prices of these goods make little difference. And so these are the factors that can all shift the supply curve to the right or the left, depending on the way they behave.